In 2017, three game designers, Ari Gibson, William Pellin, and David Kazi, released a game about a little bug who explored an unfamiliar and haunting world called Hollow Knight. The game was originally conceived by Ari and William, and the world of Hollow Knight, called Hollow Nest, is a vast underground cavern filled with many different biomes and places to uncover. This world can be dark and foreboding at times, leaving you scared and unnerved. But it can also be serene, with a hint of melancholy. Through your exploration of the many different biomes, you find this place to be corrupted, and it becomes more evident the more time you spend here that something is wrong. While you are discovering what Hollow Nest is hiding, you run into a cast of odd characters in increasingly odd locations that help to cement this world as still being alive, albeit on the brink of disaster. It climbed to critical acclaim and has a huge cult following, as it is hailed as being one of the best indie Metroidvanias. Although the directors made a conscious effort to never attach their game to overarching genres, as they felt it would limit their creativity during the design process. But Hollow Knight was still inspired by the many different games the creators either played throughout their life or wanted to emulate. So, what are some of these video game inspirations? One of the first games that comes to mind is Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Released in Japan in 1994 and 1997 respectively, they are the foundational side-scrolling, platforming, boss-fighting action map quest games, otherwise known as a Metroidvania. It is up for debate whether these older games are Metroidvanias themselves, but it is obvious that Hollow Knight and many other side-scrollers set their roots in these games. While the connection from Hollow Knight to Super Metroid and Castlevania is obvious, I wonder how many people first thought of another game as being one of their main inspirations. A game that shares a lot of the familiar world building and aesthetics to Hollow Knight. A game with a familiar level of difficulty and challenge, where the player's hand is not held, but instead, you are treated as someone who can and will overcome whatever is thrown at them. That game is, of course, Dark Souls. From the grand Gothic architecture to the dark, putrid, and claustrophobic sewer levels, to the deceptively calm and serene forests, among many other biomes. It's no wonder why people have theorized that one of the major inspirations to Hollow Knight was Dark Souls. They even both have the same death mechanic, where when you die, you go back to pick up everything that you lost, with the added suspense that if you die again, you will lose everything. Even when you search through the forums of the internet for what inspired Hollow Knight, you are more than likely going to come across some posts about this very topic. But what if I told you that they were wrong? What if I told you that the many forums and people lied to you? In an interview with MCV, William Pellin, one of the creators for Hollow Knight, said, "I hadn't actually played much of Dark Souls when we were making the game. I played a fair bit of it after because people talked a lot about how Hollow Knight was like Dark Souls. As I have also talked about how Hollow Knight is like Dark Souls when recommending this game to many of my friends. Not that I or others are wrong on there being a connection between these games though." R. Gibson even states that the soul mechanic was taken directly from Bloodborne's health mechanic, as he did play all of Bloodborne. William goes on to explain, "I think we're referencing a lot of the games that Dark Souls references, so maybe there's a lot of connections there." This analysis makes a lot of sense to me, but I want to dig deeper than that. I want to get into the creations of both of these games, Hollow Knight and Dark Souls, to find out what are at the hearts of these games that make them appear to be so connected, whether you believe that Hollow Knight is taken from Dark Souls or not. By understanding the foundations of these creative works, I hope to uncover and share a new perspective on how video games are made and the many parallels that run between some of the best games out there and some of my favorites. So, starting at the beginning, the creation of Hollow Knight started where a lot of games start out nowadays, in a game jam, or really, a couple. In the Ludum Dare 27th Game Jam, William Pellin and Ari Gibson released a game for the theme of 10 seconds. Their product was Hungry Night. And to be honest, it wasn't that good. It didn't receive that great of an impression from many people during the jam, but it did include a familiar main character, and the concept of the game had you killing hordes of bugs in a fight to survive, all to kill 3 bosses. Seem familiar? The theme was introduced and brought to light as you had to eat something every 10 seconds to live. In the Ludum Dare 29th Game Jam, the theme was Beneath the Surface. In this 72-hour jam, Ari and William changed the view to a side-scroller and had the player spelunking through dark caverns in this more exploratory experience. Although they never finished the game, due to a larger scope than anticipated, it gave them a lot of inspiration and ideas for the gameplay and narrative of what would later become Hollow Knight. And while neither games became that big, experiencing both game jams allowed William and Ari to explore gameplay and narrative ideas that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to without the general themes and time crunch that these design contests afforded them. Also, in between both jams, Ari and William continued to talk about their dream game, and Ari sketched some concept art of the various characters and world that later became central to Hollow Knight. Although he does note that these are a little darker in theme than where the characters ended up in game. And I just want to take a moment to say that I think looking at all this stuff is really cool. To look back on these bare bones and basic ideas, some of which were under time crunches, and see what would become a full-fledged game later. It gives me a lot of excitement about the messiness that comes with creating anything, especially video games, and the perfection that lies within so much imperfection. After the game jams, Ari and William worked on it for a couple of years, then they put it on Kickstarter to get funded. After getting funded in 2014, they worked on it more, and eventually it was released in 2016 as a full-fledged 2D action-adventure game. While this story of Hollow Knight's inception is inspiring, it doesn't tell the full breadth and amount of design decisions that went into the actual creation of the game after these initial pushes. As even though they had some gameplay and narrative ideas, making the game and testing it for fun mechanics requires a lot more time and decisions than they had made thus far. And while we can never truly know all of the decisions that they made throughout the game creation process, we can gather more information about what they were going for by understanding what other games they were inspired by and why. William explained in an interview that some of the games that directly inspired Hollow Knight are Faxanadu, Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link, and Mega Man. All of these being older games made before 2000, and they are all side-scrolling action-adventure games with some form of platforming. They do all have different feelings, but similar mechanics associated with them, but it is really easy to distinguish them all from each other. Notice how I said, though, that these are all the games that directly inspired Hollow Knight, specifically its gameplay. But what of those that indirectly inspired? Ari Gibson and William Pellin talk about some of the games they played earlier in their life, these games being Super Mario Bros., Zelda, and Zelda Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask, in particular, harnesses the theme of being set in a strange, melancholy world where they crammed in as many odd moments as possible. Pellin explains that that's the stuff which is really interesting. And you know, to me, that fits. I mean, look at all these dudes in the rest of Hollow Knight. It is packed with odd scenarios and strange people in weird locations with a world that is changing around you. This is similar to Majora's Mask, but without the time crunch. Hollow Knight is a game where you aren't the center of attention to some degree, and the world Hollow Nest lives beyond you and before you. We can also see the inspiration that Zelda had not only on William and Ari, but also on every other game developer and player at the time. Although I never played it as a kid, to a lot of people, Zelda helped to redefine what the point of games were as it became a sort of textbook for 3D action games, says Miyazaki in an interview with Rolling Stones. You were dropped in a random place, in a world you knew nothing about, and you were told nothing about it. The point of the game was to explore and discover a world that didn't revolve around you, a world that lives without you, just like in Hollow Knight and just like in Dark Souls. Although I couldn't find an interviewer that directly asked Hidetaka Miyazaki what the inspiration for Dark Souls was, we know that the most obvious inspiration is firstly Demon Souls. Released in 2009, just 2 years prior to Dark Souls, they are comparable in their combat, NPCs, story, and world building. Demon Souls is a very similar game to Dark Souls, and thus I relate the two as they both have a heavy focus on overcoming difficult combat to level up with tried and tested attributes like strength and dexterity to then show off your skills by overcoming a fierce boss. The only difference between Demon Souls and Dark Souls seems to be those of aesthetics and story, with some minor gameplay mechanic tweaks here and there. So this can't really provide us with a direct connection to Hollow Knight, as in terms of major inspirations, I lump Demon Souls and Dark Souls together. So what about what inspired Demon Souls then? In an interview with Eurogamer, Miyazaki said, "Of course, there are parts of Demon Souls that are inspired by Kingsfield, but we were very much aware that we wanted to make a new title with Demon Souls." This game, Kingsfield, was released in 1994 by FromSoft. The lead designer on it was Naotoshi Jin, and it is a first-person action-adventure medieval game that does not care about the player. The world is similar to Demon Souls and Dark Souls, as it is a bleak place filled with depressing NPCs who talk in verse, and you are constantly running into traps and enemies to keep you on your toes. While it is obviously a major inspiration to Demon Souls, there are differences in story, world layout, mechanics, and of course, the change from first person to third person. So then, what inspired Kingsfield? And what inspired the inspiration to Kingsfield? And how about the inspiration to that? Look, while we can keep on going down the list and try to understand what the inspirations are to inspirations, it can become highly reductive to all of these games and creative works. My point in this video is to understand the foundations of both Dark Souls and Hollow Knight and how they relate, not uncover the truth that everything that we do as humans is connected and inspired by those before us, as this should be obvious. I want to take a different path. I want to stick with Miyazaki, the creative director of Demon Souls and Dark Souls, because when thinking about video game inspirations, or really inspirations for all creative works, it is important to step outside of that medium, for there is a person behind the curtain. And people are inspired by a great many things that can subtly bleed into their works, both consciously and subconsciously. So, going back to Dark Souls, what are some of its other inspirations, and what does the game draw from its creator's personal life? Well, as a kid, Miyazaki stated that he loved to read books and manga, especially some fighting fantasy game books like Wizardry and Vertmu. These were similar to D&D in that you could make your own story by confronting problems and turning to specific pages to make decisions, all of this to progress the story. They were kind of like single-player RPG in book form. Later in life, Miyazaki did not initially go into game design. He came into it after graduating from Keio University with a degree in social science. Only after his friend suggested he play Ico did he truly want to get into game design. He states that game awoke me to the possibilities of the medium. I wanted to make one myself. He also stated in an interview with Eurogamer that a lot of the inspiration for Demon Souls came from medieval Western media like Conan the Barbarian, Excalibur, and Frazetta's fantasy art. While obvious, it's important to point out the connections that Dark Souls has to these medieval Western medias, old European architecture, and of course, the many themes of Christianity spread throughout the world. We also know that the manga Berserk has been a major inspiration for Miyazaki in all of his works, as he features it lining his top shelf along with Devilman. Although he never directly states what in his game is a manifestation of this inspiration, we can infer some enemy and boss designs, as well as a couple of armor sets and weaponry. Maybe even some larger themes if you dig deep enough. Some of the games he says that are still his favorites are Magic the Gathering, Ultima Online, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Although Miyazaki does love The Legend of Zelda, and we can obviously see an inspiration between Zelda and Dark Souls because their world design and player agency are so similar, he himself does not link the two together. When I was a student, The Legend of Zelda was truly monumental. So to be perfectly honest, The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls are different games belonging to different genres, and they're guided by different concepts of game design. They don't need to aspire to the same ideals. While I agree with him on his analysis, this led me to understand Dark Souls in a completely different way. He goes on to say that the creation of Dark Souls, from the outset, we started making it based on a back-to-basics concept. He wanted to re-embrace the trial and error and difficulty that was in older games. So while he is right that Dark Souls and Zelda are different games and completely different genres, there is a connection between them. That connection manifests in Miyazaki's want to re-embrace how games used to treat players. This, to me, is where I started to see the true connection between Hollow Knight and Dark Souls. In an age where so many games were and still are holding your hand and giving you as much information as possible so you never get lost, something was being lost. The vibe of older games was to let the player figure it out. This led us to use our imaginations and problem-solving skills. This also came with the added benefit of players being more immersed in the world by seeing themselves as a stranger, eager to find out about the world. This led to less of a gap between the player and the player character because we didn't have to catch up to some knowledge that we should know with unneeded exposition. In the case of Zelda, that was the primary theme. The creator Shigeru Miyamoto wanted the player to experience the game as if they were lost in the wilderness, much like he was when he was discovering nature in his backyard or taking hikes without a map and stumbling upon various landmarks, like a lake. The more I dug into and tried to understand Miyazaki and the creators of Hollow Knight, the more I realized there was a central theme that they all drew from. Of course, they all found inspiration in European architecture, personal experience, as well as nature in Zelda. But to me, the central theme was older games. I chose to learn more about Hollow Knight and Dark Souls because although they were made independently from each other, so many people made a direct connection between them. Even their world designs structure themselves in a way where backtracking is necessary, and learning the world and where everything is located is really helpful and almost necessary as well. But before you can even learn the world, you will fumble around due to Dark Souls' lack of a map and Hollow Knight's unique map mechanic. The gameplay for both of the games is to get lost in dangerous areas only to discover small shortcuts and passageways to and from other parts of the world. Only through trial and error will you discover what their worlds are hiding. And this idea is inherent in older games. No one there is going to help you. The world is hostile, yet you can still find so many beautiful moments, made all the more because you discovered them. And as someone who hasn't played many older games besides Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Metroid, some arcade classics, and a couple of others here and there, it never struck me as all too important to look into older games as a source of inspiration for creating and learning about newer games. But going through and discovering the inspirations for Hollow Knight and Dark Souls has made me want to go back to the basics and discover what I had missed, as well as join some occasional game jams when time allows. These stories also reaffirmed to me that personal experiences contribute so much to every creation. Ari Gibson talks about how Hollow Knight is built upon our love of classic Nintendo games. So this is the peak of a 30-year cycle, growing up, playing them, gaining enough skills to create our own homage to those games, and releasing it on the same platform that inspired us in the first place. What we play, what we read, how we grow up our interests, and other people will affect everything we make and do in our life. This is true also for all those books, games, and art that we have consumed. This is why it has become so important to me to understand the foundations of the many medias I love. But I just have to remember to be curious and let it all in.